Step aside, ma'am. Routine check. The security officer's voice was cold as Jessica was pulled from the line at Denver Airport security checkpoint. Eyes around her stared. Just another ordinary woman with an old backpack. Nothing special. But when they searched the hidden compartment and pulled out a worn gold Delta Force badge, the entire checkpoint went dead silent. Conversation stopped. Radios crackled. Eyes widened in disbelief. Who was she? And why did one faded badge make hardened security officers freeze like they'd seen a ghost? Jessica Jess Thompson was 34 years old and officially invisible. For years ago, she'd been someone entirely different. Someone whose name appeared on classified mission reports that would never see daylight. Someone who'd earned the right to wear the Delta Force badge through trials that broke most people before they even began. Now, she was nobody special, just another woman traveling alone, carrying a worn backpack, and wearing clothes that came from discount stores. The kind of person security guards barely noticed unless they were looking for someone to hassle, which unfortunately they were today. Denver Airport security checkpoint had a reputation for being thorough to the point of cruelty, the kind of border crossing where power-hungry guards took their frustrations out on travelers who couldn't fight back. Jessica had known the risk when she'd chosen this route, but sometimes a dangerous path was the only path available. She'd been waiting in line for 47 minutes when the selection happened, not random at all, despite what they called it. The guards had been scanning the crowd, looking for someone who seemed vulnerable, alone, unlikely to cause problems if they decided to make an example. Jessica fit the profile perfectly. When they called her forward, she moved with calm compliance that came from years of tactical training. No sudden movements, no signs of resistance, nothing that would escalate a situation that didn't need escalating. But her eyes moved differently than civilians would. In the 3 seconds it took to walk to the inspection area, she cataloged every exit, every camera angle, every potential weapon within reach. The habits of someone who'd survived in places where awareness meant the difference between coming home and disappearing forever. Old instincts never died. They just learned to hide better. Bag on the table, the lead guard commanded, his tone suggesting he enjoyed the authority more than the actual security. Jessica complied without comment, setting down the backpack that contained everything she owned in the world, which wasn't much by most people's standards, but every item had been chosen for functionality over comfort, durability over appearance. The kind of gear selection that only made sense if you'd lived in places where your equipment was the only thing standing between you and death. Traveling alone? The guard asked, unzipping the main compartment with unnecessary roughness. Yes. Purpose of visit? Tourism. The lie came easily. The truth, that she was running from people who wanted to use her past against her future, wasn't something security guards needed to hear. They pulled out her spare clothes, her basic medical kit, her camping gear, standard items that any backpacker might carry. Nothing that raised immediate suspicion. But the guards weren't satisfied with standard. What's this? One of them asked, holding up her tactical knife. Camping tool. Pretty serious camping tool for a tourist. Jessica said nothing. Experience had taught her that explanations usually made things worse with people who'd already decided you were guilty of something. A small crowd had gathered to watch the show. Other travelers who were grateful they weren't the ones being searched, security personnel who had nothing better to do than watch someone get humiliated for the crime of traveling while looking defenseless. None of them had any idea what they were really looking at. The woman standing calmly while her belongings were scattered across the inspection table had once infiltrated terrorist compounds that existed only in satellite photos. She'd extracted hostages from situations that military planners had written off as impossible. She'd earned commendations that were classified at levels most people didn't know existed. But that was before the mission that went wrong, before the investigation that destroyed careers, before she learned that heroism was less important than politics, and that sometimes the best way to serve your country was to disappear completely. Now she was just another traveler hoping to cross security without incident. Unfortunately, hope wasn't enough. Planning a little camping trip or trying to start a revolution? The guard's joke earned scattered laughter from his colleagues as he held up Jessica's tactical knife, like evidence in a criminal trial. The blade was military grade, designed for situations where failure meant death, but to them it was just another opportunity for mockery. Looks like someone's been watching too many survival shows, a female officer added, her tone dripping with condescension. Let me guess, you think carrying Boy Scout gear makes you tough? Jessica maintained her silence, a slight smile barely visible on her lips. She'd heard variations of these comments her entire military career, from drill instructors who thought a woman had no place in special operations to enemy combatants who'd underestimated her until it was too late. The mockery had never broken her before. It wouldn't break her now. What else we got here? The lead guard continued his inspection with theatrical enthusiasm, clearly enjoying his audience. Paracord, compass, water purification tablets. Somebody's really committed to this whole outdoor adventure fantasy. More laughter from the growing crowd of onlookers. Jessica could feel her eyes on her. Some amused, some pitying, all of them seeing exactly what the guards wanted them to see. A woman playing dress-up with equipment she didn't understand, pretending to be something she wasn't. If only they knew. The memories flickered through her mind unbidden. Sand and blood, and the weight of responsibility that came with being the only thing standing between hostages and certain death. The feeling of a rifle in her hands as she provided overwatch for teammates whose names would never appear in history books. The moment when everything went wrong and heroism became liability. She'd earned every piece of equipment in that bag through trials that would have destroyed most of the people now laughing at her expense. But explanations were dangerous. Questions led to investigations, and investigations led to places she couldn't afford to go. You know what I think? The female officer said, stepping closer with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never faced real danger. I think you're one of those military wannabes. Probably failed basic training, and now you play soldier with surplus store gear. The words stung in ways Jessica hadn't expected, not because they were true, but because they reveal how completely she'd erased herself from the world that had once defined her existence. She became so invisible that even the possibility of her real identity was dismissed as fantasy. Nothing to say for yourself? The lead guard pressed. Cat got your tongue? Jessica met his eyes steadily. I prefer to listen. Oh, she speaks. Another round of laughter. Well, since you're such a good listener, maybe you can explain why someone who looks like she could barely handle a grocery bag is carrying enough gear to survive a zombie apocalypse. Before Jessica could respond, the most thorough of the guards found what she'd been dreading. His fingers traced the outline of the hidden compartment she'd sewn into the backpack's lining, a space so carefully concealed that it had passed dozens of previous inspections. But this guard was different, more experienced. His hands moved with the systematic precision of someone who'd found contraband before. Well, he murmured, working the hidden zipper. What do we have here? The checkpoint's ambient noise seemed to fade as he reached into the compartment. Conversations continued around them. But Jessica felt the world narrowing to this single moment, this one guard's hand moving toward the one thing she'd never been able to abandon completely. His fingers closed around cold metal. When he pulled it out, the overhead lights caught the worn gold surface of the Delta Force badge, its eagle and dagger clearly visible despite years of handling. The badge that had cost her everything to earn and had defined her identity for the most intense years of her life. The effect was immediate and absolute. The laughter stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. The casual chatter died away to nothing. Even the radio traffic seemed to pause, as if the very air around them had suddenly become too thin to carry sound. The guard holding the badge stared at it with the expression of someone who'd just discovered a live grenade in his hand. His colleagues leaned in to see what had caused the sudden silence, and their faces went through identical transformations: confusion, recognition, and then something approaching awe. Jesus, someone whispered. The female officer who'd been so quick with insults now stood frozen, her face cycling through expressions as she processed what she was seeing. The jokes about military wannabes suddenly seemed not just inappropriate, but potentially catastrophic. The lead guard looked from the badge to Jessica's face and back again, as if trying to reconcile the woman he'd been humiliating with the symbol he held in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its previous authority. Ma'am, he said quietly, nobody told us. Nobody said a Delta operator was traveling today. The crowd that had gathered to watch the show now stood in complete silence, suddenly understanding that they'd been witnessing something entirely different than what they'd thought. Jessica looked at the badge in guard's hands, The symbol she'd carried through 4 years of exile, the emblem of everything she'd lost and everything she'd been. Then she looked back at his face and said the words she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Delta Team 7, call sign Phantom. In that moment, every word became meaningless because the truth had just been pulled from a hidden pocket, and it carried more weight than any uniform ever could. The checkpoint transformed in an instant. What had been a routine humiliation exercise suddenly became something else entirely, a crisis management situation that nobody had been trained to handle. The lead guard still held Jessica's badge like it might explode, his eyes darting between the emblem and her face, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. Delta Team 7, he repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. The number carried weight that transcended normal military hierarchy. Even civilians who followed military news knew about Delta Force Team 7, the unit that had been involved in operations so classified that their very existence was debated in conspiracy forums. The ghost unit that appeared in redacted documents and disappeared from official records. And this woman, this quiet traveler they'd been mocking for the past 20 minutes, was claiming to be one of them. "Sir," the female officer whispered urgently to her supervisor, "we need to verify this. If she's legitimate." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. Humiliating a civilian was a disciplinary matter. Humiliating a decorated Delta Force operator was a career-ending catastrophe that would ripple through the chain of command all the way to Washington. The checkpoint supervisor, a gray-haired veteran who'd seen enough military personnel to recognize the real thing, approached Jessica with the careful respect reserved for unexploded ordnance. His movements were deliberate, non-threatening, the body language of someone who understood he might be dealing with a predator disguised as prey. "Ma'am," he said formally, "we're going to need to verify your credentials. I'm sure you understand necessity." Jessica nodded once. She'd expected this moment ever since she'd made the decision to carry the badge with her. The symbol was simultaneously her greatest protection and her greatest vulnerability. Proof of who she'd been and evidence that could destroy the anonymity she'd worked so hard to maintain. "Serial number Alpha Delta -9, Echo Tango 0-4, she said quietly. "Operation Night Eagle, Operation Desert Ghost, Operation Broken Arrow. All classified above your clearance level." The supervisor's eyes widened slightly. Those operation names weren't public knowledge. They weren't even rumored to exist. For Jessica to know them, to recite them with the casual precision of someone who'd lived them, meant either she was exactly who she claimed to be or she had access to intelligence that made her far more dangerous than any Delta operator. "Christ," someone muttered from the growing crowd of security personnel who'd gathered around the inspection area. The atmosphere in the checkpoint had shifted completely. What had started as entertainment had become a masterclass in underestimation. The guards who'd been so quick with jokes now stood in awkward silence, understanding that they'd been mocking someone whose combat record probably exceeded their collective experience. "Ma'am," the supervisor said, his voice carrying genuine respect now, "I'm going to contact our military liaison to confirm your status. This is protocol." Jessica understood protocol. She also understood that every verification call created a paper trail. Every inquiry left digital footprints that could be followed by people she'd spent 4 years avoiding. But she was past the point of maintaining her cover now. The badge was out. Her call sign had been spoken, and half the checkpoint had witnessed the revelation. The cat was out of the bag, and it had teeth. While they waited for verification, an interesting transformation took place among the security personnel. The younger guards, the ones who'd been loudest with their mockery, now stood at respectful distances, like junior officers in the presence of superior. The older veterans moved closer, their body language shifting to something approaching reverence. "Ma'am," one of them said quietly, "my son's in the Army. He'd give anything to meet someone like you." Jessica nodded acknowledgement, but said nothing. She'd learned long ago that hero worship was more dangerous than mockery. Heroes were supposed to be perfect, and perfection was a burden that crushed people under expectations they could never meet. She wasn't a hero. She was a survivor who'd made impossible choices in impossible situations, who'd learned that sometimes the greatest service you could provide was accepting responsibility for things that weren't your fault. The verification call came back in 12 minutes. The supervisor's face went through several expressions as he listened to whatever voice was speaking on the other end of the secure line. Surprise gave way to concern. Concern gave way to something approaching panic. And panic finally settled into the careful neutrality of someone who just learned he was dealing with forces beyond his comprehension. When he hung up the phone, every eye in the checkpoint was focused on him. "Ma'am," he said formally, "your credentials have been verified. You're cleared for immediate passage. No further inspection required." But something in his tone suggested there was more to the conversation than simple verification. Jessica could read the subtext in his expression. The careful way he avoided eye contact, the subtle tension in his posture that suggested he'd been given instructions beyond the standard protocol. Someone had made a phone call. Someone with enough authority to shut down questions and ensure safe passage. Someone who knew exactly who Jessica Thompson was and what her continued anonymity was worth. The lead guard approached her with the careful precision of someone handling a live explosive. Jessica's belongings were neatly repacked in her backpack. The badge lay on top, no longer hidden, its gold surface catching the overhead lights like a badge of honor that could no longer be concealed. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I want to apologize for everything. We didn't know." Jessica took her backpack and slung it over her shoulder with movements that suddenly looked different to everyone watching. Not the casual gesture of a tourist, but the practiced efficiency of someone who'd carried gear through hostile territory where every ounce mattered. "You weren't supposed to know," she replied simply. As she walked toward the exit, the checkpoint parted before her like water. Security personnel stepped aside with nods of respect. Travelers stared with new understanding. And somewhere in the background, radios crackled with urgent communications about protocols and classifications and the kind of paperwork that made problems disappear. Jessica reached the exit gate and paused, looking back at the inspection area where her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered by a piece of metal she'd never been able to abandon. The female officer who'd been most vocal with her insults caught her eye and mouthed a single word: "Sorry." Jessica nodded once and walked through the gate, back into a world that would never look at her the same way again. Behind her, the checkpoint settled into an unusual quiet, as if everyone present understood they'd witnessed something significant, something that would be talked about in break rooms and passed down through shifts, growing the telling until it became legend. The day a ghost walked through Denver Airport checkpoint and reminded everyone that warriors don't always look like what we expect. The story of Jessica Thompson spread through the security community like wildfire. Within hours, every checkpoint guard, TSA officer, and federal agent within a 100-mile radius had heard some version of the tale. The details varied with each telling. Some said she'd been carrying classified documents. Others claimed she'd been traveling under deep cover. But the core truth remained constant. A Delta Force operator had walked among them, invisible and unrecognized, until a moment of casual cruelty had revealed who she really was. The female officer who made the military wannabe comment submitted her resignation 3 days later. Not because she was forced to, but because she couldn't bear the weight of knowing she'd insulted someone who'd earned the right to wear the Delta badge through trials she couldn't imagine. Her letter cited personal reasons, but everyone knew the real story. The checkpoint supervisor issued new training protocols, emphasizing the importance of treating all travelers with basic dignity and respect. The official memo cited professional standards, but the unofficial message was simpler. You never know who you're dealing with, so treat everyone like they might be someone who matters. But perhaps the most significant change was in the younger security personnel who'd witnessed the encounter. They began approaching their work differently, seeing each traveler not as a potential threat to be dominated, but as a person whose story they couldn't possibly know from appearance alone. "I keep thinking about her face," one of them confided to a colleague weeks later. "How calm she was, like she'd heard it all before and knew something we didn't." Jessica herself had vanished back into anonymity as quickly as she'd emerged from it. No forwarding address, no contact information, no trace of where she'd gone or why she'd been traveling through Denver in the first place. The only evidence of her passage was the paperwork that documented her crossing and the memories of people who'd learned an unforgettable lesson about assumptions. Some of the veterans who'd been present that day made quiet inquiries through military channels, trying to learn more about the woman who'd carried herself with such dignity under pressure. What they discovered was a service record that read like fiction. Combat deployments to places that didn't officially exist, commendation for actions that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, and a discharge that raised more questions than it answered. She was the real deal, one retired Marine told his ship partner after making some calls to old contacts. Whatever happened to end her career, it wasn't for lack of courage or skill. The checkpoint itself became something of a pilgrimage site for military personnel passing through the area. Word had gotten out through the informal networks that connected veterans across all branches of service, and Jessica's brief appearance had taken on the quality of legend. Young service members would request assignment to security duty at Denver, hoping to catch a glimpse of the kind of warrior they aspired to become. Older veterans would make detours to the checkpoint, paying their respects to a place where one of their own had reminded everyone what real strength looked like. A small plaque appeared on the wall near the inspection area one morning. Unofficial and unauthorized, but tolerated by supervisors who understood its significance. It bore no names or specific references, just a simple inscription: "True warriors serve in silence." Nobody claimed responsibility for placing it there, but everyone knew what it meant and why it mattered. Jessica Thompson had passed through their lives for less than an hour, but her presence had changed everything. She'd shown them that heroism didn't announce itself with fanfare, that the most dangerous people were often the quietest, and that respect should be given freely rather than earned through displays of authority. The checkpoint ran more smoothly after her visit. Travelers noticed a difference in how they were treated, even if they didn't understand why the guards seemed more thoughtful, more careful with their words and actions. True honor doesn't need an audience. The worn gold badge that Jessica carried wasn't a trophy to be displayed or a credential to be flaunted. It was a reminder to herself and anyone who discovered it that some achievements transcend the circumstances that created them. For 4 years, she'd lived as a ghost, invisible and forgotten by a world that had once depended on her skills. She'd accepted disgrace that wasn't her fault, carried blame for failures that belonged to others, and disappeared into anonymity, because sometimes the greatest service you can provide is becoming invisible. But invisibility has its limits. When you've earned the right to wear the Delta badge through trials that break most people before they begin, when you've made decisions in split seconds that save lives and protected freedoms that others take for granted, when you've sacrificed everything for ideals that politicians barely understand, that kind of achievement doesn't fade just because bureaucrats decide it's inconvenient. Jessica's story reminds us that we live surrounded by invisible heroes. The quiet woman at the grocery store might have defused bombs in war zones. The unassuming person fixing your car might have pulled pilots from burning aircraft. The reserved individual sitting next to you on the plane might have made split-second decisions that prevented international incidents. They don't wear their achievements like badges of honor, because true honor doesn't require recognition. They don't demand respect because they've learned that respect given freely is worth more than respect demanded through displays of authority. But when circumstances force their true nature into the light, when a worn badge falls from a hidden compartment, when instincts trained in combat zones become visible to observant eyes, when quiet competence is mistaken for weakness until it can no longer be contained, the revelation changes everything around them. The guards at Denver Checkpoint learned that strength comes in forms they'd never been trained to recognize, that courage often looks like calm compliance rather than aggressive resistance, that the most dangerous people are frequently the quietest, and that the most accomplished warriors are usually the ones who've learned that boasting and bragging are luxuries that professionals can't afford. Jessica Thompson walked through that checkpoint for 47 minutes and left behind a legacy that would influence how people treated strangers for years to come. Not because she demanded recognition, but because circumstances forced the truth of who she was into daylight, where it couldn't be ignored. She carried her badge not as proof of what she'd accomplished, but as evidence of what she'd lost and found again in the space between humiliation and respect. The symbol meant everything and nothing. A piece of metal that represented trials no one else would understand, sacrifices no one else had made, and achievements that would never appear in history books. True warriors serve in silence. But when silence is broken, when truth emerges from hidden compartments and forgotten corners, the world remembers that honor never really dies. It just waits patiently for the right moment to remind everyone that it was always there. In the end, Jessica's story wasn't just about one veteran finding recognition. It was about a community learning to see, to understand, to honor those who had served in shadows. It was about the power of respect, the importance of dignity, and the enduring truth that the quietest person in the room might be the one who deserves the loudest applause.